Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with the world's top economists about world-changing events. Samir Amin is an eloquent and longtime critic of how the world economy works. He is the director of the Third World Forum, which tries to promote social justice and a greener world. He is also chair of the World Forum for Alternatives. It supports the world's growing social movements. Somehow, he has still found time to write more than 30 books, both on social and economic topics, and he's published thousands of articles. His most recent book includes the aptly titled The Implosion of Contemporary Capitalism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Samir Amin. I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science. This is Smart Talk. Professor Amin, thank you for coming onto this show. I hope I can do 100 of these segments. I've done 45 so far, but there were two great economists that I had to have on this show, or else I felt it wouldn't be complete. And the two are Luigi Passanetti and Samir Amin. So I am so grateful for you to be on the show. For the audience, the Western audience, who may not know who Professor Amin is, Professor Amin is the economist from the first days of his book Unequal Development, has tracked the cataclysmic forces of capitalism as they've traversed from the post-World War era to the current days. Not only that, he's a theorist in the spirit and the stature of Marx himself, a great social scientist, a man whose works are numerous, and probably the analyst that has caught more of the changes in the capitalist world than any other economist living today. So with that, Professor Amin, you've essentially called and tracked the traverse of capitalism, especially since post-World War II. And I don't think anything that's happened today is a surprise to you. The question, of course, is how do we get out of the quandary that we now find ourselves in? I think you believe that the path for a solution will be difficult and probably a bloody or a revolutionary ending to the current impasse that the system finds itself. Now we're Georgists here. Henry George was the economist back in Marx's day that Marx said was the last gasp of the capitalists in terms of theory. Well, we don't like to think that's the case with us. We're essentially anti-monopolists today. And of course, I think monopoly is embedded in all the problems that we face today. But your comments, Professor Amin, on the traverse that capitalism has taken since the war and since your book, Unequal Development, leading up to the events ultimately today of outsourcing, globalization, the lack of convergence of the third world to the first world as promised by Walter Rostow, for example. And now we find ourselves in a situation where the right now is making a comeback because many of the problems that capitalism has run into are almost insoluble peacefully. Your comments.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I hope it's correct. It's very nice with respect to myself and to what I attempted to do. Thank you. Well, you see, I think that in order to understand what is the challenge today, we ought to go back not long ago, to go back to the very short period of 15 years between 1975 and 1990. 15 years. As from the end of the convertibility of the dollar into gold and the adoption of new system abandoning Bretton Woods system of financial and monetary organization of of globalization. Now, during that short period, something occurred of decisive importance. A much higher level of centralization of the control of capital over the economic system, but also over the political system. In a very short period, because monopolies are not something new. They appeared at the end of the 19th century, as analyzed by Hilferding, Hobson, and Lenin, but they have moved through different successive phases. But I believe that during that short period, we moved to a much higher level. I wouldn't say of concentration of the property of capital, because it remains disseminated, but concentration of this centralization of the control of capital by those oligopolies or monopolies. That was noticed by few people, not only myself, but also in the United States at this time, Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy. Yes. And together, as of 1978, I think exactly, we published some articles in Monthly Review, but also not much later, I wrote a book saying that we are entering a new phase of monopoly capital, qualitatively new. That is a phase which is characterized precisely by a much higher level of centralization of the control. This is the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure for a social and political change that is the coming to power of oligarchies. You know, in the United States, you speak a lot of the Russian oligarchy, but you don't speak about the US oligarchy, the European oligarchy, the German, the British, the French oligarchies. Oligarchy is everywhere now. I mean, all systems, at least in the developed world, the triad, US, Europe, and Japan, but also elsewhere, the system is run by oligarchies. That is very, very different from what it was previously. When it was run, we say by the bourgeoisies, of course, who are in capitalism, but by a different pattern of social, cultural, and political organization of the bourgeoisies, with a much lesser level of centralization of its control, of the control of the major monopolies than it is now.
Why did that centralization occur at that particular point in time? I agree with you, I understand what you're saying, but why then? Why then would it appear?
I will come to that. Why? Okay. Because the systems which were the previous systems, on which I will come later, has exhausted their capacity of continuing. But anyway, now we have these oligarchies are controlling the whole productive economic system, the national economic system. That is, practically all activities, economic activities, have been reduced to the status of subcontractor for the benefit of oligopolies. A subcontractor de jure in many cases, or de facto. For instance, I give an example, which is very visible in the United States as well as in Western Europe. The family peasant modern agriculture have been completely subordinated now and is subcontracting. It is controlled overstream by the monopolies which provide the credit, the fertilizers, the equipment, etc., and downstream by the monopolies also which are controlling the commodification, the market for the agricultural products. To the extent that at the current prices, the income of the farmer is close to zero, if not negative in some cases. And they are surviving thanks to the enormous transfers of subsidies from the state, which means that the common people are paying for an income which is absorbed, which is captured by monopoly capital and transformed into super profits, upstream and downstream, and not only super profit, but I call them monopoly rent. Now, that is new because previously the monopolies were existing, but they did not reach the level of being able to control practically the whole economic productive system. Now, the oligarchies are also controlling the political system after having been able to, I would say, domesticate the political class, the political parties, whether so-called left or right, electoral parties, which are behaving in the same way, that is, which are in the service of monopoly capital and exclusively to its service. To the extent that the old conflict between the traditional bourgeois right and bourgeois left, or workers' parties accepting the rule of capitalism, has lost its meaning. Now, this is very dangerous because it means that electoral representative democracy has lost its credibility. And I can see an example of this tragedy recently in the US with the election of Trump. But we can see also similar phenomena in Europe, for instance, with the rise in the voices captured by the fascist parties or the neo-fascist parties almost everywhere. Now, that is something qualitative new. It means that the old political system is finished, is dead, and that we have a new political system in which this oligarchy controls everything. Now, that is very dangerous for democracy because it means that you can vote freely, perhaps, in the sense that the elections are correct and I wouldn't say transparent, but correct. But whether you vote red, rose, blue, white, the result is the same. The parliament which meets the next day is unable to decide anything. It is continuously repeating, the market demands. What is the market? It means the monopolies. There is nothing as the market. It's the capitalist, oligopolistic market. Now, but we have reached also a point where this oligarchy is also controlling the whole system of information, I would say disinformation, the medias. Well, you are an exception, perhaps. You are a marginal exception. But the main medias, whether in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere, are completely controlled by a handful of those monopolies in the hands of the oligarchy. To the extent that I'm saying now that what we have is a media clergy in the service of the financial aristocracy, just as the previous clergy in the Middle Ages was at the service in its time of the landed aristocracy. Now, that is a qualitative change. Now, I am among those, not many, who felt that qualitative change quite early, as of the 70s and 80s of last century. And I wrote it. But I also wrote at this time that this coming system is not viable for a number of reasons. Not only ecological, which are important, but which are not marginal at all, but of which I shall not speak now. banal contradiction. This absolute power of the oligarchy means a continuous concentration of the distribution of income and wealth. It cannot go forever. You remember the demonstration in Wall Street. The 1% against the 99% against the 1%. Perhaps 1% is small, it might be 5%, but anyway, it means that the people are getting conscious that the system is operating exclusively, and this is the first time, exclusively to the benefit of this very tiny minority of this oligarchy. Now, this being said, there is no possibility of now that has led the system into a deep crisis, a systemic crisis. You know, capitalism has gone through many crises, as any system in history, and it has been able, as any system also, I would say, in history, to overcome its crisis and to start again with minor or less minor changes, adjustments. Crises are usually new crises, in the sense that the very reasons, the rationality which has led to the recession after a few years of restructuring the system, adjustments, this very logic leads to recovery, and the system continues with qualitative or quantitative changes, but nothing more than that. Now, our crisis, and this is why it is a systemic crisis, is a crisis in L. That means that the rationale which has led to the recession, this same rationale cannot lead to a recovery. You know, since at least 20 years, we are hearing every day or every week on the televisions and the medias that the recession is coming to an end, we are moving out, etc., etc. It's funny, it's ridiculous, and it's a lie. It's not the reality. You know, when we are moving from a 0.2% of growth to a 0.4% of growth, people on the TV say, oh, gloriously, we are gloriously moving out of the crisis. No. Now, which means that this crisis cannot be overcome but by questioning the very fundamental logic of capitalism. This is why one of my recent books, the title of which is Ending the Crisis of Capitalism or Ending Capitalismic Crisis, with a question mark. This is the challenge. We cannot end the crisis, this type of crisis of capitalism. I will give an example. It's not the first one, it's the second systemic crisis. The first systemic crisis started almost exactly a century before the second. If we say the second systemic crisis started, let's say, 1975, the first systemic crisis started end of the 19th century, around 885 or 90. Right. Now, it was that first systemic crisis which Lenin captured the importance of it. And he said it leads to a revolutionary time. Revolution is on the agenda. And indeed, how this first long crisis was overcome. It was not overcome by beautiful economist recipes, not even Keynes, who came much later. Not at all. It was, this first long crisis led to what? A series of events which the economists, the Nobel Prizes, for instance, ignore because they are not economic events. The First World War, the Russian Revolution, 1929, the Nazi, the Imperial Japan, the Second World War, the defeat of Nazism and fascism, the Chinese Revolution, and a little later, Bandung, that is the first wave of victory of the national liberation struggle in Asia and Africa. This was the response to the first long crisis. It means gigantic political and social change, for better or for worse. That's not the point. But anyway, the crisis cannot be overcome. And I'm saying it was not Keynes, because Keynesianism or quasi-Keynesianism was implemented only after the Second World War basically in Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and some others, and also in another way in the US. It started even before with the New Deal of Roosevelt. But anyway, that was the answer. The answer was political change. Now we are moving into a similar period. That is a period which I would call, for lack of vocabulary, a period of wars and revolutions, which are not necessarily good revolutions, and the wars are not necessarily positive liberation wars. They can be of all sorts. Now, this is the challenge that the peoples everywhere in the world, in the US, in Europe, as well as elsewhere in Asia, Africa, Latin America, are facing. Now, the alternative to, therefore, is that there is no way out of that systemic crisis, but moving away from the rule of oligarchies, which means that you cannot get rid of those rules through so-called election. The case of the US with the election of Trump is very indicative of the blind alley in which election leads the people now. And it's not, as I said, the exclusive case. There have been, and there will be more of that type. It means that we cannot move out if we do not dispossess the oligarchies. And dispossess the oligarchies means having the courage, the audacity to nationalize major oligopolies. I'm not saying abolish the market and abolish small, medium, and even some big private activities and enterprises. No, I'm saying nationalize the major monopolies, starting with the financial ones, banking, insurance. They are now come to be one, and the control that they have over so-called transnationals, all that. Now, this is not very popular because the answer is immediately said, oh, you want a state bureaucracy, you want a state capitalism to replace private capitalism. But the state bureaucracy has proven, in the case of Soviet Union, for instance, its inability to be efficient, and the market, going back to private property and market rule, has been the way out of the permanent crisis of bureaucratic system. There is this danger. I'm not saying there is no danger to nationalize, but I think it opens the road to a possible, even if gradual, socialization, democratic socialization of the management of the economy, of the large enterprises, of what are today transnationals, oligopolies, and monopoly capital. Open the road to socialization. Now, we should discuss that. We should discuss that with at all levels, from the level of the employees, wage earners in these enterprises, to the citizens, the communities, the local communities, etc., etc. And and when I'm saying socialization, that is the way to also introduce in a positive, active way, the ecological dimension. I just mentioned that among others, but also many other issues. Now, in my book, The Implosion of Contemporary Capitalism, in I think the conclusion of the last chapter before the conclusion, there are pages under the title of Audacity. We need audacity and more audacity. And I gave the example of what could be done in a country. Since the book was written in French, I took the example of a country like France. But should this book be written for the US people, you could take a very clear example of how the US economy is managed and how it could be managed. I mean, that would be the good answer to those people who, or the good answer, a good input in the debate of the people who demonstrated in Wall Street against the 1%. Now, that is the way to start moving out. You see, I'm not saying the revolution, R, capital R. I'm saying revolutionary advances. That is not minor, qualitative changes, but which are not solving all problems of humankind in 24 hours. This is childish to believe that it can be solved in that way. The long process, the road, I remain a socialist, and I would say even if this word is considered as the devil by many people in North America, I'm a communist, I'm a Marxist, not a Marxian. Marxian looks for me as the name of an academic school of thought. Marxism is far more than that. It is associating analysis, thinking with action for changing the world. Now, that would be, it's a very long road. I don't know how long. It might be a century long. It's not a question of a revolution, but revolutionary advances which prepare the ground favorably for other revolutionary advances. And we shall see at what point in time we could say afterwards, this is the date when the society started moving out of capitalism. Now, that is such progress in the socialization of the management of the economy would open the road to establishing real democracy. Democracy cannot be reduced to the blueprint of pluriparty elections because it has become a farce, even in the case of the US. I have seen nothing as poor as the debate between Trump and Hillary. No argument were given, no real challenge to which the 95% of the people of the United States are confronted every day was discussed. Nothing of that. Same in Europe. You can see that whether you vote social democrat or socialist, or you vote for the parliamentary right, changes nothing. Absolutely nothing. No, democracy cannot be dissociated from social progress. Democracy is more than a tool for social progress. It is a progress by itself. It has its value by itself. But its value by itself is also a value for to the service of social progress. Democracy, or apparent democracy, associated with social regression, which is the case that we have in Europe, in the United States. You continue to have so-called democracy. You have elections. which are not completely fabricated, but they are quasi-fabricated, in the sense that whether this one or that one triumph, it is not opening the road to social progress, but maintaining the social regression continue. Now, the socialization of the management of the economy is the only way to establish a connection between democracy and social progress. Now, I'm not going to give a blueprint for that democracy. The people will invent it progressively by their action and associating it with solving gradually their major problems, whether of employment, better jobs, better security in job, security also, but also social services, good education, good health, good pension system, etc., etc. Now, this also, if we move along that way, we create conditions relatively more favorable to moving from monocentric pattern of globalization to pluricentric. The pattern, you see, in many cases when we suggest something to be done in the United States, a big country, the biggest, or in France, a relatively smaller country, or even in Europe, it does not exist, but anyway, in Britain or in France or in Germany or elsewhere, or in China, or in India, big countries, or in smaller countries like Egypt, or even smaller like Senegal, where I'm speaking from. We are being said immediately, oh, impossible, because of globalization. Now, that is blackmailing, because globalization is not something new. It's something which have been always associated with the expansion of capitalism at a global level. But it has taken different forms. Now, after World War II, we had a period of globalization, but pluricentric globalization. It was not the Cold War, as it is presented usually, with the military forces, US and USSR. No, it was much more complex than that. It was a pluricentric system based on three families of system. Real social democracy in the West, that is a historical compromise between monopoly capital, and it was already monopoly capital, and labor in Europe, United States. The so-called really existing socialism or socialisms in plural, the Soviet and the Chinese Maoist pattern, and the third world national popular, I'm not saying populist, demagogic, I'm saying popular systems from India to Nehru's India, to Nasser's Egypt, to Nkrumah's Ghana, etc., etc. Now, we had that pluricentric pattern of globalization. Now, due to the fact that the three systems lost their capacity, their efficiency, not only the Soviet system, not only socialism, but social democracy also, the so-called Keynesian pattern in the West, or the neo-Keynesian pattern, or I prefer to say the regulated social democracy pattern of the West. It's also the national popular systems which got out of breath within a period of 10, 20, or 30 years here and there. Now, the three systems, because none of them had been able to move beyond its recipes, broke down. It broke down in different ways. It broke down in the case of Europe with the end of the traditional left-right conflict It broke down in the case of the Soviet Union with the breakdown of the Soviet Union itself, along with the breakdown of the pattern of so-called communism of that country. It broke down in China with the end of Maoism, and the first set of reforms started by Deng Xiaoping. It broke down in the South with the end of the national popular systems, replaced by quasi-neo-colonial pattern of power. Now, that created precisely opened the way to the re-establishing of the dictatorship of capital, but capital which had moved itself from monopoly capital of the old time to new monopoly capital with a much higher degree of centralization of the control of capital, as I said before. Now, what we need, therefore, and questioning abolishing the private property of the oligarchies would create the conditions for a new pattern of globalization. I'm not saying of non-globalization, but a different pattern in which you would have a margin, a wide margin of autonomy for the peoples in the different places in the world. Because even if we belong to the same global system, the same world, the same planet, and we have in common a number of challenges, such as the climate challenge, for instance, but also the objective conditions for the vast majority of the working people are totally different from one country to another. Also, I don't like the word culture because it is utilized and overutilized to designate anything and everything. But political history and patterns of organization which are different. Then we would have a polycentric globalization. And I think that this is starting moving beyond capitalism.
Essentially, you've made the thesis, and I understand the basis of it, but essentially you've asserted in your writings, and it's kind of Marxian in its definitions, that there's a purchasing power problem endemic in the capitalist system, that it tends and can't help but tend to monopoly. As long as you have a monopoly on nature and you can extract rents, then eventually, no matter how much you displace central capitalism, whether you go to the periphery or any place else, sooner or later, the lack of effective demand will give you these secondary financial problems, which will then start to centralize the finance in one place, and then everybody becomes workers and subcontractors every place else in the world, regardless of the countries. Now, this is an inexorable, overriding proposition that you have discovered, and the empirical evidence kind of bears that out. The money flows north, the work flows south, the control stays north, the major monopolies are in the north, their technology, as you pointed out, they have monopolies on nature, on military force, and on finance, and on the press. And this is a displaced capitalism that's not even national in scope, so that the grounds for national actors, or even polycentralism that you've articulated, really are fragmented to the point where it's hard to put that back together. This is a system that the wealth is concentrated now. The opportunities are taken and given wherever they are. The structure of the system allows for no change. The political actions have been disarmed, and essentially, although you say that we should have a polycentric system and that we can make changes at the workplace and we can have local democracy somehow feeding back into the system, it would seem highly unlikely that could occur.
You see, your comment is quite relevant, is important, and I don't know from which side I should start. Maybe I should start by saying the following. You see, for about 3 or 4 centuries, if not more, a little more, what we call the West. That is, it started in Western Europe, not in Europe, in Western Europe, in the small triangle between London, Amsterdam, and Paris, which means Britain, France, and the Netherlands of today. And then it expanded a little more into Europe towards Western Germany, Northern Italia, and later a little more northern and eastern and southern, to include more or less the whole of Europe, even if unequally. But also through the colonization of the Americas and the creation of New England, not the United States, it moved into North America and the United States, which came out of its War of Independence, and then the Civil War, became the major capitalist center. Now, these are all people who are white-skinned, who are European ascent, that is, we could say, roughly, of Christian historical culture. But I'm not insisting on that, as I mentioned, have ruled the world. They have created the globalization in their service. Yes. They have conquered the world. They have submitted the Asia, Africa, Southern and Central America, Latin America and the Caribbean, to their own logic of expanding. Now,
but the logic was inexorable. The logic had to play out that way because it's structured with private property on nature. It must do what it did. There was no choice there.
Yeah, there was no choice, and it made impossible for the rest of the world to catch up and become similar to the centers, because the logic of accumulation in the peripheries was submitted to service the logic of accumulation in the centers, and not the reverse. I mean, when the World Bank speaks of structural adjustment, it means the structural adjustment of the peripheries to the need of the centers. It is requested from Congo to adjust to the needs of North America. It's not, the World Bank does not ask the United States to adjust to the needs of Congo. Therefore, it's a pattern of globalization which is polarizing by nature. Now, today, with the centralization of capital control, this triad, North America, I mean the US plus Canada and plus Australia, which is a little geographically far, but it belongs to the same system. Europe, I would say West and Central Europe, not the semi-colonies of Eastern and Southern Europe, and Japan, which are honorary white, one would say. This triad intends to maintain its exclusive power at the global level. And this is the root for what I'm calling the collective imperialism of the triad. Now, this is a qualitative change also, because imperialism in the past was to be conjugated in the plural. There was nothing that you could call imperialism, but imperialist powers, which are then the only way for imperialist powers, US imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism, German imperialism, in conflict, even including in military conflict. But now we can speak of the collective imperialism. NATO is the symbol of it. It has a leader, a military leader, the US. It has subordinate allies, but they are allies. They are not colonies. They are allies but subordinate, because they think, rightly from their point of view, that they cannot control the whole planet except through a continuous militarization of the management of international politics. And this is the reason for the wars, the continuous wars of presently they are in the Middle East, but they could be elsewhere also. You know that both Hillary and Trump considered possible wars against some major power, such as Russia or China.
Professor, let me ask you this. In the centralization of this triad, they're liquidating their own manufacturing structure, turning it into cash. The investment is made in the periphery, if it's made now, although it's probably overinvestment there. And so the profits coming from the periphery are added to the liquidation of investment up here, turning into a super fund of cash and marketable securities that needs to be constantly valorized itself. And there's no real easy way for that to be done.
You are correct. This is a fact that the delocalization of many industries, not all, not the military industries, for instance, or not high technology research, or not command of information systems. I wrote on that precisely in 1978 a book written together with André Gunda Frank that we called Do Not Wait 1984. You know, the book of Orwell. We refer to the book of Orwell. And we described the system in which a good part of the common industries would be delocalized from the centers to the peripheries, but under the control of monopoly capital of the centers. Now, that is proceeding, but they are not able to ensure for sure that control of the delocalized industries, because they are not sure of what will be the reaction of the people and possibly change of governments in countries of the South. Specifically in those countries which have proven throughout their modern history to have been able to develop their own autonomous projects, such as China and perhaps again Russia. So this is why they need this militarization of the management. Now, that is leading, and we can see it, to chaos. That is, if the alternative, which I have called audacity, of attacking at the root, that is dispossessing the oligarchies in the very centers itself, if that does not happen, and it doesn't seem, unfortunately, to be on the agenda for the coming visible future or years, then we'll have chaos. Just as the first long crisis started with chaos. 1914, the First World War, was the first chaotic response to the crisis. But it created the conditions for the Russian Revolution.
Well, Professor, here, the environmental conditions pose the barrier to change and modify the system, because the time constant of environmental impact is probably relatively close at hand. And if that's the case, the strategy would be for any ruling group is to hang on with the current system as long as you can and hope for the best. But meanwhile, there's mountains of cash and credit piling up in the center. There is, other than trading and exchanging profits by capital with each other, it becomes a zero-sum game between the elites, and all the profit has been sucked out of the system. There's really nowhere to go unless you break the monopolies, and as you pointed out, it's a pretty difficult thing to do, so that essentially the ship is the controls are welded together, environmental environmental Armageddon is appearing, and we sail directly into that impact.
Again, your comment is relevant and important. I would not say that it is easy to dispossess the oligarchy. Of course not. But there is a starting point, which you indicated in your comment. I mean, this system cannot, the pumping of the value created by hundreds of millions of workers throughout the world, and particularly in the industrializing peripheries, such as China and some other places, is submitted to the control of an integrated financial and monetary global system. That is what we have presently. But this system is perhaps the weak link. It's the vulnerable point. China, for instance, which is active in globalization, participates in it, and in the short run benefit from it at the level of trade and at the level of real investments, but China is not part of the global integrated financial system. And that can develop in the future in two directions. One is the one requested by the United States, particularly Trump today, that China should accelerate its move towards its integration in the global financial and monetary integrated market dominated by the dollar. And there are pressures, including pressures from inside the Chinese society, from those segments which are directly related by partnership with foreign capital. But it can also evolve in the other direction. That is precisely putting an end to the integrated financial and monetary system. Having relatively, and China will possibly choose that way to go. That is, the menace of Trump could be full benefit from China, because it could support in China itself tendencies to shift the center of gravity of development towards more internal market for popular classes, and second, replacing the markets that they would lose or be reduced in North America and in Europe by other markets in the Big South and other arrangements with other countries of the Big South.
But the Big South, let me just say, the Big South markets, and I think it's true, if you look at the wage rates in the South, even including in China, there's no real effective wage increases. A few places like China did have some, but if you add up the wages of the South, they're definitely being compressed and lowered, so that it's highly unlikely that China would even find a market for itself with its own people and in the South. I fail to see how they can find that when the pressure of the subcontracting worldwide is to push down the wages, even though the standard Western reporting agencies say there's increases in wages. If you look at prices, wages, the shift of the money from wages in general to profits, the general tendency is down everywhere, including the South.
No,
Okay.
No, you are oversimplifying.
Okay.
There is this tendency, and particularly for the weak countries, such as most of the countries of Africa, or the countries which are in a deep crisis, like for instance Brazil today or Venezuela, to take some instances in South America. But on the other side, you can see that the level of wages and income, lato sensu, which includes social services, which include a lot of things which are less visible, is moving up in China. Slowly, but it is moving up. And therefore, and it is moving up also, it was moving up in a country like Brazil through redistribution of income to the poorest classes and so on, so that there is the alternative of having an enlarging internal market for popular classes, lato sensu.
No, but the popular classes in China, again in China, you're talking about a service economy, but that presupposes manufacturing profits from somewhere. And China is going to face the automation problem of its manufacturing sooner or later, and the social services, I believe, from anywhere, are ultimately supported by manufacturing. And if you can't get that, then eventually you could borrow money. You could do what the United States did. It paid for working class incomes to stay high, higher than they would have, by mortgages and so forth, to supplant the fact that they were losing their manufacturing. So I would argue China would be a victim of that same kind of thing.
You are giving examples which are correct, but which are also one side of the problem. Okay. I'm speaking in more general terms. Okay. I mean, an auto-centered pattern of development, which doesn't mean autarky. It doesn't mean not having relations with the rest of the world, but it means trying to submit the relations with the rest of the world to the logic and the needs of your internal growing market. Okay. Now, the internal growing market is composed basically, or to a large extent, of rise in real wages, but also of social benefits, also of a less unequal distribution of income between the 80% of the working classes on one side and the 20% representing the new middle classes in countries such as China or India, for instance, or Brazil. It also means reorienting patterns of investments towards, in the case of China, the industrialization of internal Western provinces, not only coastal provinces. And all that are also avenues for a sensible economic growth.
So that you're basically saying that you're looking for a partitioning of the world, perhaps, into, let's say, a Southeast Asian a group of countries, African group, South America, North America, and Europe, that become somewhat
become able to negotiate.
I see.
When you negotiate, you make concessions, but if you are in a good position, you compel the other also to make concession. You don't make concession and the other nothing. That is not negotiations. The pattern of globalization we have today is not a pattern negotiated. It is you have to take it as it is or leave it. You have no margin for negotiation. We create a margin. We should create a margin for real negotiation.
So we'd have to have regionalization.
That would. I'm not a defensor of this ugly Trump, but that opens a room also for repatriating indeed some of the industries in North America. Why not?
So you're basically saying that you would expect that a good solution, assuming the environmental problem to be down the road, would be a regionalization to equalize bargaining power. I mean, do you see any signs of that regionalization taking on an independent life of its own, basically the way it's structured, the world's structured today?
Yes, lack of vocabulary, we could call it regionalization. After all, the idea of regionalization for South America with ALBA of Chavez was an idea of that kind. Now, it is I would not say the page is turned. I think it's in bad shape today, but it could come back because history has never an end. Another pattern of regionalization is the so-called Silk Roads of China. That is a rapprochement between China, Russia, Central Asian countries of the former Soviet Union, and possibly becoming attractive for Southeast Asia and for India. Now, if you add the number of people of that region, it is more than half of humankind. Yes. Don't forget that in something like less than 100 years, at the end of this century, the population of Asia and Africa alone will represent 80% of humankind. And the population of Europe and all the Americas, North, Latin, and Caribbean, only 20%. 5% or less for Europe, 5% or around for United States plus Canada, etc. And only 10% or less than 10% for Latin America, but 80% Asia and Africa. Now, that means that the ground for regionalization is there. A bad example of regionalization is the European one. Not that I am anti-European. After all, if the Europeans want to come together, why not? I don't see harm in that. But they conceive the European Union as a sub-system of the global neoliberal system. And that is a fundamental mistake. It was not only the view of the traditional right in Europe. Unfortunately, the left, the socialist and social democrat left, accepted this vision. And now we can see the European system breaking down. Brexit is symptomatic of that, but not only Brexit, the crisis in Greece, including if Greece is presently submitted to dictatorship of Northern Europe, of Germany in particular, that is not viable. And tomorrow, with what we have seen starting in Italy, we'll have other weak links with the voices moving up in Spain from the traditional left to Podemos. That is, the European system is precisely imploding because instead of conceiving itself as a peoples-based European Union, it has conceived itself as a oligarchy-based European Union. And that is not viable.
We could go on and on, Professor, but I think we've got enough for 2 shows here. And is there any other topic that's near to your heart that you would like to discuss? If not, I would ask you a few other questions. Is there any other concepts that you'd like to get out that your mind has thought of as a path through our problems?
I would add 2 topics additional briefly. One is ecology, and particularly the climate change. And the second is the agrarian question for Asia and Africa, and partly for a good part of Latin America.
Now, go ahead.
Yeah, on ecology, I think there is, I'm not of the opinion of Trump, I think there is a dangerous climate change. And that is indeed a challenge for the whole of humankind. But it has to be, the response to the challenge should be integrated in the thinking of the alternative. It cannot be just one additional topic or one additional set of challenges. It is part of the fundamental, in the sense that the logic of capitalism cannot give an answer to that problem. Why? Because the logic of capitalism is a short-run logic.
Right.
Profit. Profit is short-run. It is a few minutes for the person who is operating in Wall Street. It is at most 15 years for the people who are investing in factories, in real invest, but hardly beyond that. Now, we need a longer view, much longer view. We need to think, internalize in the economic choices the long run. Now, Marx had said it before. It's very curious, but Marx, and it's easy to find because it's the last sentence or the last paragraph in section 15 of chapter 15, so it's easy to remember, of book 1 of Capital, in which he says, Marx, that capital accumulation destroys the basis for human wealth. He doesn't say value. Man and earth, which means today we would say humankind, peoples, and ecology and the nature. Now, but this sentence had been unfortunately forgotten by historical Marxism because, as usual, people are in a hurry and they give priority to the immediate solution for the immediate problems, even if it is at the cost of more damages in the longer run. So we have to internalize it. And we cannot internalize it unless we start thinking of another pattern of organization of society, of political debates. Where is the long run? You see, the pseudo-electoral system is very unfavorable to that because the people who are elected want to be re-elected, and to be re-elected, they want to have some achievement visible in the 4 or 5 coming years, even at the expense of the future. Now, I don't know how humankind will solve this problem. I'm not a prophet, and I have no blueprint in my pocket. But I think the debate should be open and continuous on that. This is one point, the ecological dimension. It has to be internalized in the model of organization of society. The other one is the agrarian question. Now, until now, we have still around 3 billion, that is, if not half, close to half of humankind who are rural, basically in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, the ongoing process is a process of accelerating the disintegration of peasant societies to the benefit of rural-urban migrations. And this was the pattern of development of Europe in the 19th century. Europe at the start of the 19th century had also a majority of rural people, including England. At the end of the century, or just before World War I, it was already a small minority. And now it is a very small minority. But that was made possible by 2 factors. One, the industries, the patterns of industries of the 19th century were much more labor consuming than the modern technologies are. And second, there was the massive emigration of Europeans. Now, in 1500, Europeans, and there were no Europeans outside of Europe at that time, represented about 15% of global humankind. In 1900, the Europeans plus the European descent, that is the Americas, North and South, plus Australia and New Zealand and here and there, 36%, which means that the Europeans had the gigantic advantage of being able to migrate massively. Now, assuming, like the World Bank suggests, why don't you do in China, in India, in Brazil, like we have done, or like they have done in Europe or North America? It's just impossible to do it. Because we would need, one, labor-intensive industries, where are they? We would need massive out-migrations, not by thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but by hundreds of millions. Where would they go? We would need, for Asia alone, for China and India, 4 or 5 Americas. Where are they? And therefore, there is no alternative but reviving peasant agriculture. Now, it doesn't mean folklore, maintaining them in or either a ghetto of poverty or a folklore for tourists. No, it means we have to invent a pattern of progress of the productivity of agriculture through maintaining peasant family agriculture. That is what the Chinese, to a certain extent, are doing, or doing partly at least. And that is the challenge for Africa and Latin America, as well as for India, for instance. Now, these two aspects of the challenge, I think, should be added to what I said in more general before.
That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and past episodes, please go to our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.